Thanks everyone for coming. Bruce Maxwell's out of the country for a couple of weeks, so he asked me to introduce our speaker today. So it's really a great pleasure to have Luther Talbert here from Plant Sciences and Plant Pathology. I've been looking forward to hearing your talk. Now, Luther's been at the university since 1988, and he got his PhD from University of Wisconsin and then spent time at University of Oregon, and now he's here, and he is an expert authority on breeding and genetics of wheat, in particular spring wheat, and he spends a lot of time thinking about varieties that will withstand drought and heat and insect pests, and those are all topics that a lot of us think about, thinking about climate change. And Luther contributed intellectually a lot to the Montana Climate Assessment and the agricultural chapter because of his thinking about what it means for wheat in Montana. So thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming. And I'm looking around the room, and I'm less of an expert in breeding wheat than some of the other people in here. So so we don't have to be, if you guys have any corrections or things to say, feel free to do it. So I've been talking with Bruce Maxwell about this for quite a while because of a project we did several years ago looking at could we empirically sort of look at what was going to happen to wheat production, especially spring wheat production in Montana, due to the rising temperatures and projected continuing to rise temperatures. And that reminds me of one thing I want to say before I get going too far, because as I started preparing this, wheat breeding program is the most interactive sort of project you could possibly imagine. We work with tons of people, and I'm going to forget to mention them, but I will say on their behalf that as I was doing this, I remembered my own PhD, or actually my master's advisor, giving me a piece of advice that I've kept in my mind all these years. And we worked one day, and we were coming home from the field, and he knew I wanted to be a college professor and have a job like he had, breed varieties and do research and stuff like that. And he gave me a piece of advice that really resonated, sticks in my mind. And he said, Luke, if you want to be successful, you're going to need to find people that are smarter than you and work harder than you to collaborate with. And it's sort of stuck in my mind all these years, and that turns out to have been very easy to do at Montana. And I'm not going to mention anybody's name, but most of the work has been collaborative with a lot of other people. So this is what we're talking about. And I want to introduce wheat, and I see the audience. For a lot of you, you don't need to really know this, but for some you might need to know, and I'll sort of review that. So wheat production in the US is divided among different classes of wheat. In Montana, we primarily go hard wheats, and those, based on their starch characteristics, are basically used to make bread mostly over the world. And you see, we are spring wheat and winter wheat, about half and half in Montana. And then there's other classes of wheat grown in different places around the country and around the world. And in every one of these places in the country and the world, there's a wheat breeder like me who's thinking about breeding wheat and adapting it to their environment. So one other thing that I just want to say, and I know this is not necessary for a lot of you, but the difference between spring wheat and winter wheat is actually only one gene. And for winter wheat, it's a gene that causes it to have a cold treatment before it will head and produce seed. And spring wheat has a different form of that gene, so it doesn't have to have that cold treatment. And so spring wheat in Montana gets planted as soon as the snow melts in the spring, and they harvest later in the summer. Winter wheat has to be planted in the fall and get that cold treatment, and then it can grow and head and produce seed the next year. So what happens is these classes of wheat have stayed the same for 100 years probably where they're grown, but what changes within these classes of wheat is the varieties that are grown. And hopefully for the better, but as we'll see as we go along, for the better is in the eye of the beholder and the different people that might be impacted by a wheat variety. So I wanted to say this just also to make the point that wheat breeding programs are very, very long term. That we start out always by making crosses between different varieties or experimental lines we like. We go through a process of deriving what's called inbred lines, which just means that they're homozygous or they're not changeable at any of their genetic loci, and so we can do replicated tests and test in multiple sites and stuff like that. So if you go out and drive down Huffine Lane and you look at the post farm out there, you see a lot of these little bitty plots, and that's the breeding program plots is mostly what that stuff is, and a lot of that is visual selection for just traits that we like. Is it too tall or too short? Is it have certain stem characteristics we like and stuff like that? And then eventually we'll go through this selection process, winnow it down to relatively few lines, and then they start to go out all around the state. And at the very end, like year 10, a line that we think we like might be grown in 40 or 50 places at 30 places around Montana. And so it's basically trying to find. And if we're really lucky, we go through all this work and one of those lines is a new variety. It's better than what we started with, and we release it for farmers to grow. And if we're really, really lucky, farmers actually like it too, and they grow it and buy more seed, and it becomes an important part of the agricultural landscape. So we start over every year, and so there's some breeding programs, they call it the pipeline. So every year, new crosses, and every year potential new varieties are coming out of the so-called pipeline. So, and a new wheat variety can have a really, really big economic impact. So notice I didn't say a big positive economic impact, because it doesn't necessarily have to be positive. We hope it's positive. But let's say farmers liked it and you had a successful variety in Montana grown on a couple million acres over a 5-year period, which is not an unreasonable amount of acreage. If you calculate average yield at about 30 bushels, that means that from that one variety, there's about 60 million bushels that are going to be sold to customers all over the world. And since each bushel of wheat makes about 40 loaves of bread, this one wheat variety is going to be used around the world to make something like 2.4 billion loaves of bread. And so everyone is impacted. So you hope farmers like it here, and you hope whoever's making the bread down here is okay with that new variety. And we're going to talk about some of the challenges in breeding programs with that. So I just pulled this off just to remind us the first economic impact is at the level of the farmers. And they will grow these new varieties, and they'll take them to the local grain elevator and sell them. And a couple things to see here is that they get paid by the bushel. And so for a farmer, the more bushels they have, the happier they are, because they make more money. And variable depending on the world market, they may get paid a little bit more if the protein percent in the kernel is higher. And so this was January of this year. And it looks like there's about a 50-cent protein premium for a extra, 1% of protein in wheat grain. And so farmers care about that economic impact. So everything I'm going to talk to you about today is basically economics. That what we do is very, very tied into the commodity market, and it's all driven by the market and economic considerations by a lot of people. So there's two things that we really focus on, and we really do. One of those, with David Weaver, who's sitting back there, is we work a lot with the big insect in Montana, which is called the wheat stem sawfly. I put this note in from 1890 just to show the wheat stem sawfly has always been a problem in Montana, and it's still a problem in Montana. So that tells you right away that plant breeders can't do anything very magic, because if they could, it would not be a problem anymore. But I'm not going to talk about this today. But what I'm going to talk about is this area. And this is a postcard that was sent in 1911. And it's and the writing in the margin says, that spring wheat was a poor harvest, and basically implying because it was too hot and dry. So it's always been too hot and dry in Montana, really, for wheat production, especially spring wheat production. So it's not new that this is a problem in Montana. In fact, I think you could say that every single wheat variety grown in Montana is drought tolerant, as close to as drought tolerant as wheat gets already, because it has to be, or it wouldn't be grown here at all to begin with. But so what can plant breeding programs do? So I'll get to that. But this is where I started talking to Bruce, because he did this. I still think it's really a cool little experiment, or looking at data in a really interesting way, and we have this nice setup. And we cooperate with research faculty at all these several different research centers around the state. And these research centers are also official weather stations for the US government, for NOAA, and so their data gets entered there. And they've kept all the weather data at these stations for, some of them, I don't know, 75, 100 years. But at least since the program started growing this, what we call an advanced spring wheat yield trial. And so what this trial has is all our best experimental lines compared to check varieties. And this is a process of trying to find something better that we can release to farmers. But not by happenstance, it's probably good planning by someone. There's been a single check variety called Thatcher that's been grown in every one of these sites every year for the last 60 years. And we have all this weather data. And so it was a chance to look at this weather data and the variety Thatcher and say, what is the impact of temperature change really, or climate change, on the performance of spring wheat? Because we got this common variety and we have all this weather data. So we did that. But this is like 10 years old data, but someone should go back and do this again, but probably won't be me, but someone could do it. But what you see, first, no surprise, the temperature's gone up at all these stations over the years. Annual temperatures by about 0.03 Celsius, July temperatures by a little bit, 0.01 Celsius. But look how big March temperatures went up. 0.08 degrees Celsius per year. And if you do the math on that, that's about 7 degrees Fahrenheit, that March temperatures are higher now than they were even in 1950. So that to me seemed incredible. It's so incredible that when we were doing this, and we wrote this paper and I submitted this paper, and it always bothered me that I came in like at 4 in the morning one morning, just say, I must have made a mistake. The temperature can't really have gone up 7 degrees, which just seems like totally amazing. But it turns out you don't have to rely on me, that this is the same thing that's been found by all the climate assessment people, that March temperatures in this area have really, really gone up. So these two temperatures are important for spring wheat, because spring wheat's planted as soon as the snow melts. People can get in the field and plant spring wheat. So as soon as the warmer the March, the sooner they plant. And July temperatures, we'll talk about a lot, impact grain filling period. So this is the trend. And the other thing I want to mention, so this is just regression lines drawn through the data over these years for the temperatures at these different months. So this is March annual temperature, and then July temperature. But you see this trend goes up. If you have enough data, you can see this trend. But you also see every year it's different. And that's going to be important as we go on too, that the variability is really, really huge. And so what we'll get to is kind of at the end, and maybe some of you guys can weigh in. How do you develop a variety that's going to be ideally suited for a year like this, and also suited for a year like this, because the farmer doesn't know what's going to come from year to year, and they're just going to plant the best variety available. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay. So this slide just shows what you might expect. So this is just a regression of planting date of the wheat nurseries around the state by year. And in 1950, it was a little over 120 days after January 1st. 2010, it was like almost 2 weeks earlier that people are planting spring wheat in Montana. So if you just stop and think about that, that can't be bad, right? I mean, we have a longer growing season, and that's always been the challenge of all agriculture in Montana. It's growing season's pretty short, and it's not so short anymore because people are planting spring crops earlier, you would think. And you could take this variability and just look at a correlation. So what is the correlation between temperature in March and planting date? It's very high. What about in yield of this common variety that we've had in there all these years? And it's negative 31, which just means if you think of a negative correlation here, it means the earlier you plant, the higher the yield of thatcher. And so what this data, I think you could conclude, is that the fact that it's warmer in the spring has probably been a very positive thing for spring wheat production and yield in Montana. I think you person would be safe saying that. But on the flip side, it's also getting hotter in July. And that we see a negative relationship between July temperature and grain yield. And we'll talk about test weight, but it's another measure of the soundness of grain. So what's happening in July as the temperatures get hot? And this is going to lead us into talking about what a plant breeding program does. So this is just a chart I pulled out about wheat production. What are the ideal temperatures? What temperatures does wheat like to grow happily and healthy and produce optimally? And this is the sort of desired temperature down here at the bottom. And so we're not too bad, maybe a little warm in April when wheat is starting to grow and mature, and it might not tiller quite as good. But for most of the growing season, we're okay. Like the optimal temperature is 15 to 22, we're 19 to 23 during this stage. So we're pretty good for growing wheat during that stage. But where we fall apart with spring wheat is in the July and August period, the wheat is going from this stage where it's just starting to form seed. And in Montana, it's a very short period of time when this starts until the plant is mature and the plant's brown and it's ready to harvest. It's senesced, there's no photosynthesis going on. And it's between this time and this time that the plant has to fill the seed and make the yield, put starch in the seed and make it yield. But it's too hot. I mean, it's already too hot. It's always been too hot in Montana in this grain field period, and that reduces yields. And we could see that looking at thatcher. The hotter it gets in July, the lower the grain yield is. And so this is a problem for wheat, and it's a problem that is projected to continue to get worse as temperatures during these months, during grain field period, keep increasing. And that's where plant breeding comes in to save the day. Because the consequence of the late season heat stress is that grain doesn't have as long to fill, and you have smaller seed and thus lower yields, and thus farmers don't have as many bushels to sell. So what could plant breeders do? And what has happened in Montana and has happened is incorporation of genes that sort of fight back on the climate and have genetic capability of sort of fighting back, staying green, which means they're undergoing photosynthesis and starch is being deposited in the grain, and to fight back and make that period a little bit longer. And so that has been what has actually happened over the years. Just want to tell a little story about that, actually. So this was, we as plant breeding programs, we do cooperate with tons of people, not just in Montana, but all over that do plant breeding programs. I can tell another story, but it might be interpreted wrong, so I better not. So, but one year we had, and this was probably 15 or 20 years ago, but North Dakota State, who has a very brilliant plant breeder, had put a line in our trials that they just had a number, ND695. And it was very depressing for me as a wheat breeder to see this line in our trials because it was always way better than everything we had. It was awful, really. It's like, oh my God, no one's going to grow Montana varieties anymore. Everyone's going to grow this variety from North Dakota, because why wouldn't you? It was so much, it was better than anything we had. So I was kind of depressed about that, but was back in Bozeman, and we're waiting for our trial to ripen so we could harvest it. And looking across the field at all of the lines in our trial, that everything had senesced and was brown. And we always plant in 3 replications, so there's 1 replication here, 1 replication here, 1 replication here. But I could just look out across the field, and there are 3 plots that were just as green as they were like 2 weeks ago. And so first I was annoyed because I was ready to harvest, and that plot was, you know, not the best thing. But it turned out that that was this variety reader, that in hot, dry conditions in Montana, it just stays green for a long time. And it turns out, and I'll show a little bit of data, that's why it yields so much. And the nice thing about plant breeding is that our buddies in North Dakota, it's legal for us to take one of their varieties and make a cross with it, with one of our varieties. And once we do that, MSU owns all these progeny. And so it's that's how plant breeding sort of progresses. And then we selected from that a variety called Vida, which had this reader sort of trait, which we call the stay green trait, which just means the leaves stay green for an extended period of time. And this is a picture that the MSU photographer Kelly Gorham took, but it really shows the difference. And this is a Vida-like line, and you see it bright green, and it's probably early August. And this would be a traditional variety, which has already turned brown and senesced. So this guy is still like charging ahead, undergoing photosynthesis and filling grain. And this old variety that we used to use is brown, and it's not undergoing photosynthesis anymore. And no surprise that this yields more. And so it's really changed the landscape in Montana. These 2 varieties, Vida and Reader, have sort of dominated, have been the leading acreage for probably 10 years or more in Montana because of this drought tolerance provided by the stay green trait. So success story, right? Well, let's get to that. So, yes, I'm going to say yes. I'm not going to say it's not. But so one other thing that I'm not going to talk about today, but I did want to mention, and maybe I don't need to, but I will anyway. But underlying what I'm going to talk about from here on out is the fact that in the last few years, the ability to do molecular biology in wheat genetics has just like completely changed, just a total transformation of what you can do doing molecular biology. So we've always done that kind of stuff. And this is a picture of a student from 15 or 20 years ago, Julie. And we used to make genetic maps and things like that. And we'd have a lab full of undergraduate students with little pipetters and doing PCR reactions. And they, go on for a year, and we'd have some little wheat map. And it was, it was great for us. It was fun. And we'd run through a lot of students doing that. And it'd take forever, and the map wouldn't be that great. But just in the last 2 or 3 years, there's just been this total landscape shift. And what we do is I think we still have to mostly isolate DNA, right, Jason? So they don't do that for us yet. But once we do that, we send it off to this central lab, and we get back, not the marker by marker that poor Julie had to do, but we got back 90,000 of them, and, bang, they're right there. And so what we can do is just like a total, I actually haven't processed it yet. It's just so much different than how things used to be, but it's just this total change. So that's gotten a lot better, but we don't really care about the DNA markers per se. What we really care about is the phenotype, which is the performance of the plant. And there's no easier way to do that. No one's ever devised an easier way to do that And we have always done that, is planning trials in all these sites, and someone still has to plan it, prepare the field, control the weeds, do all this stuff, and then keep your fingers crossed that, you know, a hailstorm doesn't come along after you do all that and destroy what you did. So that hasn't changed, and that's still really, I think, it's a big, still as big a challenge as it ever was, is to understand. Because what you want to do is associate these genes that you're looking at with some actual characteristic that you care about. And measuring that characteristic is still a great big challenge. So all that stuff underlies what I'm going to talk about from here on out, but I'm not going to mention it specifically. So let's look at some actual data. So this grain field period, or what we call stay green, and the kind of research we do is we cross this variety Vita with this long stay green by another sort of normal variety that had a normal senescence period, and derived a lot of progeny lines and tested these at several places around Montana, including Bozeman. And just looking at the correlation between this grain field period, or how long the leaves stay green after heading, and grain yield, in dry conditions, it's really, really high. So 0.49, that's a very, very high correlation. But it's kind of interesting that it didn't really have any impact at all in irrigated conditions, which leads me to believe it's probably something going on with the roots in these. But we could conclude from that that this is good. Genes for a long grain field period increase grain yield. So that's good. But now let's move to, so this all an economic question. We're market driven. We're not really philosophically driven by anything. It's all what the market demands. And so when we produce varieties, these guys, this is Jason too, by the way. This is a picture of you at a field day several years ago. So, yeah. But anyway, these farmers, they want to hear about yield and maybe protein, but mostly yield, maybe protein. I don't know, probably not. But yield really is what they want to hear about. And they know all our varieties by stuff like grain, how much it yields, how tall it is it resistant to the Sawfly, and all this kind of stuff. But these guys, and this is a picture of some millers and bakers from Japan visiting our cereal quality lab in Bozeman. They don't care about grain yield. They care about how well these particular varieties make bread, and they know this. So they could tell you, if you called a miller in a big company in Japan and asked him, what do you think of Vita? What do you think of McNeil? They would know. They would tell you what they think of it and how it does for making bread. And so Montana is what our niche is in the market, is our weather cooperates with this, and we try to breed for that, is to make strong gluten wheat that is going to be used for making bread all across the world. And so if you want, you know, if you have gluten intolerance or you want a no gluten wheat, this is not a good place to come to. So you want to find that someplace else. We don't do that. So strong gluten is kind of the calling card for Montana wheats. But, so that's our sort of what the millers and bakers want. But it's been my feeling over the years, it's been really, really hard to get these stay green varieties that have really strong gluten. And it's kind of it's sort of a gut feeling, but it also comes from looking at those 10,000 lines every year in the field and selecting the stay green ones and trying to find ones that also have strong gluten. It's been really, really hard. And so we're in the midst of a little experiment to say, is it because there's some negative genetic correlation between this stay green period and gluten strength? And so if we're selecting for long stay green period, are we just at the same time selecting for low gluten strength? And so these are both two traits that are hard to measure. Gluten strength is not the easiest thing to measure on a lot. But so in process, this would say yes, there is a significant negative correlation between these two traits, that it doesn't look that high. My gut feeling is probably higher than that, and we don't see that big a correlation because they're both traits that are hard to measure. But yes, there is this negative genetic association there. So I want to go back to this economic part of the variety thing. And so everyone that is impacted by new varieties cares about yield. So farmers, it's bushels per acre that they care about. If you're a miller, you actually also, yield is your primary characteristic because you want to know how much white flour can you get out of a bushel of wheat. And that varies for every lot of wheat, and it varies a lot because of the genetics. So the environment has an impact too, but the genetics, what the genetics of the variety is. So if you're talking with millers, they're talking about milling yield all the time. If you're talking with bakers, they have this thing they call baking yield that they're really, really interested in because they like flours that make a lot of bread per unit of flour. So if you think about that, what's in 1.5 pounds loaf of bread? There's two main components of that. One is flour, and what's the other one? It's water. And which one costs a lot? Flour is expensive and water is cheap. And so if you're a baker, you really are interested in baking. So it's just an economic question for them. And I wanted to show this about these sort of stay-green varieties. So this is 5 common varieties that farmers in Montana might grow. And down here we have this gluten strength characteristic. You see the strongest one is McNeil, and then we go down till we have these 2 stay-green varieties, Reader and Vida, that are the weakest ones. And on this axis is the bake water absorption. So this is baking yield. If you were a baker, you care about this value. And you would prefer McNeil because it has more water, and you make more money making bread if there's more water added, probably. But there's some things you don't also like when it's so strong. So this is too strong because it also takes a lot of energy to mix this dough. And so this is probably too strong even if you're a baker. And you might prefer something around in here. But just to make the point of this economic, so we're not philosophically doing some noble thing, it's all an economic question. What if you're a miller? Do you like this kind of wheat with really high water absorption or not? And I guess I would leave you guys to think about that a little while, but actually they don't, because they're not going to sell as much wheat to the baker. And so it's kind of the trend, or it's taken me about 25 years to put all these pieces together in my head, but I think the idea is here. So the millers want to keep the bakers happy, you know, that it's pretty good. So somewhere in here is probably what, for the economics of everybody, is what we're looking at. Okay. So a couple other little plant breeding things. So we have this negative correlation between the gluten strength and yield due to this stay-green trait. And that is always the case in breeding programs, and that's what plant breeders, that's why it's an interesting job, is you always have these negative correlations. One that happens everywhere is that grain protein tends to be negatively correlated with grain yield. And so that's always a challenge that everyone addresses. I want to look at something with that. And right here in Montana, there's an interesting one with our major pest, the wheat stem sawfly, that if you develop varieties that head later in spring wheat, they tend to often avoid sawfly damage. And so it's very positive for sawfly damage, but the later varieties head in Montana, they tend to yield less too. And so you have this sort of negative relationship even with that to deal with. But here's a global one that to me, I think it's kind of interesting. So one thing that happened in the world 50 years ago or so was the introduction of semi-dwarf wheats. Has everyone here, actually some, I know the old guys have. Have the younger guys heard of the idea of the Green Revolution? So you guys have everyone's heard that term. Because it's class, a lot of people have never heard that term. But so this was just introducing these genes for shortness, or so-called semi-dwarf habit, into what was taller wheats at the time that everyone grew. And those semi-dwarf habit wheats, we'll see they yield more. And so they've pretty much taken over the world, and all over the world, these semi-dwarf wheats are grown. But what's the impact of that semi-dwarf growth habit? So we did this little experiment where we crossed a modern variety that we developed called McNeil with what was the most important historical wheat in the US, one called Thatcher, that came before McNeil, and looked at all these progeny lines. And what we saw was the semi-dwarf habit gene from McNeil did cause a lot higher, significantly higher grain yield, but it also caused lower grain protein. And so now we have this negative correlation that we're fighting again. And I put this slide in here. Actually, after I made it, it was kind of depressing too about how slow plant breeding programs go. But in this cross, because we could do all this great molecular biology, we could look in all these lines, what's the effect of this gene for semi-dwarf habit from McNeil on the performance of all these progeny lines. And we see that the grain protein was less, the low volume, which is a measure of economic quality of the line, is less. But what about all the other genes in McNeil that have been accumulated over the last decades of breeding to try to combat this negative correlation? And they're positive. And this is 40 years though, and positive for low volume. And so the point of that, I guess, is that over the years, very slowly, what the breeding programs have done is sort of try to combat this negative relationship by adding very slowly other genes to try to push this protein level up. Man, that's slow though, right? Oh my gosh. So that's, I guess, the lesson for that is for the stay green, the RHT kind of thing, or the stay green varieties, there's hope that we can add other genes besides that to try to get the gluten strength back up. So in the last couple minutes, I want to talk about one more thing that I think is kind of interesting, to me at least, and it goes to this idea of climate variability, and it's unpredictable. So a farmer doesn't know what the weather's going to be next year. And so what a person would like is a variety that's going to do relatively okay, depending on whether the March temperatures are up here or whether they're down here, because he doesn't get to change varieties on just based on what the temperature is that year. So you'd like to have a variety that would do relatively well in all these different conditions. And that's become a big interest actually all over the world in plant breeding. And so I want to talk about this concept of plasticity of a variety. And it's to manipulate the plant so that it changes it has the genes that allow it to change its growth habit depending on how it senses the environment. And so if you looked at grain yield in wheat, if you took how much all the seed weigh, how many seed you get per spike or head, and multiplied it, the productive tillers are just tillers, the stems that produce heads, and multiplied it by that equals grain yield. So this times this equals grain yield. So the idea is if you could develop a plant that was plastic with this and could make the decision, okay, how many tillers should I produce this year? Is it going to be a hot year and I can fill lots of tillers, or is it going to be a wet year so I can make lots of tillers, or a dry year and I should make few tillers, etc. And same with seed numbers per spike. And there's actually hope for that too. And I want to just finish by talking about this a little bit. So one of the things you can do with genetics now is you can identify regions of the 21 wheat chromosomes that have a gene for something you care about. And we're really interested in a particular gene that's on this chromosome that controls how many tillers the plant produces early in its development. And I was also a little shocked when I did this, that I crediting PhD students, Yukiko Noroka, Afaf Nasir, and now Brittany Brewer. And you might say that I've become a little obsessed with this particular gene, as 3 PhD students have devoted a large share of their time to studying it. And I should probably think about doing something different, I think. But we're on this gene for now. So if you look at this particular gene, and so what happens, the lines in the black have the high tiller allele, or the version of the gene that causes high tiller. The lines in the gray have the version of the gene that causes low tillers. And if you look and you just count early tillers, you see it doesn't matter. Whenever we did that, we had more early tillers due to this high tiller allele. So they're sort of poised now. So the idea is this plant's kind of poised. It could produce a lot of tillers, but it doesn't have to produce a lot of tillers. And this is a picture, you can see by the poor quality that I took it myself, but this is a picture of a wheat plant and the stems collected near harvest. So this is one stem, one tiller actually, and I just broke it in half. So it was a matured plant and the tiller was, you know, this tall or something like that. But if you look down at the base of the plant, these are little tillers that started early and just aborted at some point. The plant decided, for whatever reason, I don't have enough resources to fill all these. And it wasn't like they just ran out of water or something or nutrients along the way. They're so small there, and they're so kind of uniform. When that happens, the plant just decided, I'm not going to carry on with those tillers. So it made some conscious decision, if a plant can be conscious, not to produce those tillers. So Afaf Nasir, who was here a few years ago, did this, what I thought was a very interesting experiment. So she took these lines that varied for this tiller number gene, and she planted them in an experiment. So she'd have one of the treatments, the line was not bordered by anything. And so this particular line has basically 3 rows worth of water and fertilizer and stuff like that. And she grew the same lines where she had this border. So this line only has 1 row versus of resources, where this guy had 3 rows versus of resources. And her question was, what happens to those early tillers? And how does this gene that we're studying influence that? And what she saw was that so we had border, that was fewest resources for the line, no border, which had more resources. And what you see that in the no border plots, both in a dryland environment and irrigated environment, the early tillers went on to form productive tillers. And so this seemed kind of interesting. So this is a way the plant can sense, is there enough resources there for me to go on and produce these tillers and fill these tillers? But you have to have the right gene. You have to have this gene for a high early tiller number to be able to take advantage of that issue. So does that impact yield? And the answer was, for most of the treatments, no, but only in this highest resource treatment, which was irrigated plots with no borders, did having those extra tillers actually equate to higher yield. So so that gets to the question is, are there genes out there that you could add to wheat varieties that would provide this plasticity so they would do relatively well depending on the environment? So I want just to close with this to say we're not the only people doing this, and this is a program that Jason Cook is intimately involved in. Also, in fact, these you could all say are Jason's students. He's in charge of all these kids all over the country. And this is the one that he shares an office with. Here is Brittany Brewer. But all these states and a group called the International Wheat Yield Partnership, that's sort of their charge. And our goal, Brittany, is this one gene we're studying to understand the genes that are actually impacting grain yield in wheat. And there's 15 or 20 graduate students all across the country who are working on this particular project. So finally, what are the future directions for the project? First of all, I would say is to understand that it's not unlikely that everything I've told you up to now is completely wrong and I've misinterpreted everything and it's just like staggering has nothing to do with anything and I just totally misinterpreted. So what we're really going to mostly do is we're going to get the best varieties from Montana and the best varieties in North Dakota and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to cross them and we're going to try to find something that's better. And that's what plant breeders do. But just in case I was right about any of the things I said, we are starting to add genes to the stagering types to improve the gluten strength for these long grain fill lawns. And we'll continue to work on this idea of adding genes to varieties that provide some plasticity to the plant so that it might be adapted to more diverse environments. So with that, I think, thank you. Any comments or questions?
So what would be the point when you go to winter wheat from spring wheat in terms of climate? You know, that you would say winter wheat's just not going to happen in Montana anymore.
Well, if anything, it's probably going to be the opposite because a challenge with, yeah, as it gets too hot, yeah, and that's sort of an option, and a lot of people actually wonder that, you know, will Montana in 20 years be all winter wheat as the temperatures go up? Because why people don't grow spring wheat in the southern Great Plains is it's too hot in the summertime and they don't mature. And is that going to happen in Montana where spring wheat is just going to be too hot? But hopefully, you know, the little things we talked about, like the genes for the staggering period and stuff like that, will delay that happening. And plus, as climate's gotten warmer, the winters are warmer, and winter wheat, it's adapted further and further north. And so even over the last 20 years, you see winter wheat in Montana moving northward because the big issue with winter wheat is being killed by cold temperatures in the winter. And if the temperatures aren't as cold in the winter as they used to be, it's less and less likely to be killed. So actually, I think that's a good question. I don't know, you guys can weigh in, but it wouldn't shock me if in 30 years that Montana was mostly winter wheat. Like, temperatures change.
It bounces around a lot. I mean, you know, 20 years ago, maybe North Dakota had 30 to 50,000 acres of winter wheat, and it's boomed up to 600,000. Now, granted, North Dakota has 8 to 9 million acres of spring wheat, so it's a spring wheat, but the economics of it and perhaps climate differential, and there's, you know, it varies. Winter wheat grown in Alberta and Saskatchewan is also
growing.
Yeah, it's there.
But you know, the other thing I would say, Jim's a winter wheat breeder here, so he's like very defensive about winter wheat. So, but what I would say about winter wheat is probably every farmer would rather grow winter wheat because it yields, you know, 25% more than spring wheat in a typical year. So everyone would rather grow winter wheat, I think. But it's just the climate issues have made it difficult to do. Farmers get paid more for spring wheat, but I don't think it makes up for the differential and yield potential. So, yeah.
I can ask another question now. What's the climate change consequences for protein in the protein levels? Do they do better when it's warmer and drier with more protein?
Well, probably higher. Yeah, warmer, drier Julys would certainly be associated with higher protein because of, you know, the kernel of wheat is mostly starch and then some percent, 15 or so percent protein in a normal healthy wheat kernel. But if it's really hot and dry and the kernels don't feel very well, you have less starch. And so just the percent of that that's protein goes up. But protein per acre would probably still go down, I would guess, as it gets hotter and drier. But the percent will go up. So that's sort of a security blanket, I guess, for farmers, that in years where they have really low yielding wheat, it usually has high protein and they get a little bit of a premium for that, hopefully, and it makes up a little for the bad yield. Yeah.
So the state grain varieties, you showed the results for Breeder and Vita. If I'm correct, the results from Sydney and Bozeman, where we have way more moisture than in the Golden Triangle.
Right.
And the trends in moisture has been that there's an increase in moisture in the Golden Triangle, and those trends will even be more increasing moisture in June, July, August. So,
right.
Will these state green varieties maintain their successful story ability to continue feeding the grain in an extreme drought condition?
Yeah.
Because that's where the most
Yeah.
grain production occurs in Montana.
Right.
Here.
I think that, yeah, the answer is yes, because actually some of that, the genetic experiments we've done have been done in the triangle sort of region. But those are the varieties. Like if you go to north central Montana where it's been really dry, it's those stay green varieties that people grow. I mean, and they are the best. Like last year, we had that severe drought across the state. If you looked at all our yield trial data, it's those varieties, Reader and Vita, were way at the top. So that's the kind of conditions they like, or relative to other varieties, they do the best when there's a terminal drought. Relatively better than anything else, but they're relatively worse than they would be if it had rained. But relative to everything else, yeah, they like the hot, dry terminal droughts.
So, in a good year, how much would be the best variety yield, and in a really dry year, how much would be Reader, Vita yield? Meaning, how much we expect to see?
How much?
Relatively so.
How much of a difference is it? We just compiled all that data from all our yield trials and we could say, but I would say last year at Havre, very dry. So the yield of spring wheat was like 20 bushels. And Vita was like 15% better than anything else in there. So it was maybe 22 bushels or 23 bushels versus 20 bushels. But in a really wet year, like especially if you grow these under irrigation, they basically have no advantage whatsoever. And it's only when they're running out of water that you see an advantage to these. So my thought is probably they just have deeper roots that keep going down and following the water as it goes down. But that's been a really, really difficult thing to measure, and can't say that for sure. Yeah.
So I'm not going to ask anything but so, in a Fox experiment where you said that the border had that effect, do you think that's just water limitation, or do you think the wheat plants are talking to the plants next to them and saying, hey, what's going on?
Shade, yeah. So that could be too. Yeah, both that could be also the case. Well, I don't know. That's a good question. So we could do that. That's hard to do too, because you could even like seed less in a row and so not have that shading on adjacent rows, but you'd still be having this shading sort of thing within a row if you had more plants and stuff like that. Yeah, so that, I don't know.
More like roots touching or smells transferring back and forth. There's a lot of that going on now.
Yeah, maybe.
This is an area I've never seen anything about it on.
Yeah, we should think about that more, because I want to keep doing the experiments like that. But so the border variety we chose to be a really short border, trying to minimize at least the shading aspect of it. But yeah, it could have been something like that also.
When you develop a new variety, then is that patented, or what happens to that?
It is. There's a legal thing called plant variety protection, and we do that. MSU does that. So I mean, obviously, it goes through MSU. So MSU owns this. It's not a patent, but it's protected, and so that means that people have to sell what's called certified seed, or seed that was produced by a certified seed grower kind of. That's the only kind of seed that can be sold to farmers. So farmers can't sell the seed to each other and stuff like that. So that's the protection that MSU does.
Is that a source of revenue then?
It's a little source of revenue, but farmers can save seed though, and replant, which 90% in Montana, most do that. And so the first year or two a variety comes out, there's a little revenue. I think the fee charged is 30 cents per bushel, and it takes about a bushel to plant an acre of wheat. So it's some, but it's not tons. It's not like millions of dollars or anything like that. But it's $100,000, $150,000 that comes to MSU every year from that.
It costs $4,365 to register a variety with the Plant Variety Protection Office in Washington, D.C. So you want to recoup that money.
Yeah, you have to get that much. But we usually get more than that out of that. Especially winter wheat, they have some really successful varieties and they get tons of money. Yeah.
So I know the study yield
Yeah.
but I mean, you have to come to the United versus other factors. Are they going to see a yield
Yeah, that's well, you can get at that question because what you can do is, I mean, if you compare Thatcher today versus the other current varieties grown, they're grown in the same year. So you've taken out that change in the environment because you're comparing them in 2018. And you can do that and see that modern varieties, you know, yield 60, 70% more than old varieties. But then you just looking at that experiment we did, Thatcher yield has also gone up by 60 or 70% just because the climate has, you know, the longer growing season has, and maybe more carbon dioxide, I don't know. So probably both things. And but the issue that people talk about is when is this hot July going to catch up to us? And, you know, like you said, just take spring wheat out of the equation because it's just too hot. So, but it's both. But the breeding has done quite a bit. It's about a third of a bushel per year increase in grain yield in wheat due to plant breeding efforts. All right.
The increases might roughly be, you know, there's cultural practices, you know, they might account for 60%, and genetic gain for the breeding of new varieties might be 40%. So,
Right.
You know, with no-till or, you know, modern fertilizer use,
Right.
herbicide use,
Right.
you can parse these out.
And then the climate has probably pushed it up in spring wheat at least a little bit also. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much.